One of the other important things we need to discuss before we dive in fully into our art discussion, of course, is the creation story and the gods of Egypt. They figure prominently in the art, so of course we need to have a working knowledge of them. I always think the creation stories are something important to consider because they often speak to the building, right, of the world, almost metaphorically for these people. And a lot of what they're building in the story of their creation, it also relates to their reality, as we talked about with the Mesopotamian story, for instance. So the creation story for Egyptians begins in darkness. They call it the darkness of Nun, appropriately enough, right? And in this darkness, there's water. And out of that water rises the first land of Egypt, which has a pyramidal shape as it rises out of the water and comes into being. The Egyptians call this first land the Benben. So you're seeing here in the art piece a representation of the Benben. It's a sculptural representation of the Benben. But if you wonder why pyramids are such important visual symbols in Egyptian history and why they show up as, tombs, well, again, to me, you can go back and link it directly to their creation story and say, this is how their world begins in a sense. The first land of Egypt being this pyramidal shape of land called the Benben. Now, in that void, right, you have the creator god come to play. Ra is the creator god of the Egyptians. He's said to be born from a lotus flower. So this idea of, how was your creator created? What comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Um, so Ra, in a sense, born from a lotus flower in this water of nothingness, right? And then becomes the creator of everything else around him. Now, Ra will also be the sun god, so he'll be also be very important in that way. So keep that in mind as well. But here in the creator story, it's said that he goes and starts creating like the plant life, the animals, right? He's starting to create all these things. And then he's like, well, I need something that looks like me, like a person. And this is very important to Egyptian mythology that Egyptian gods are in the guise of humans in a sense, right? They look like us. And so this was very important to Egyptian mythology. And it was said that the gods of Egypt actually walked the earth, walked the land of Egypt before deciding to withdraw, in a sense, to the heavens and become the gods solely. So the sense of almost them having human-like experiences in the early days of their mythology is something to consider. But Ra is like, again, I need other people, but there's just me. So what do I do? And in the story, he masturbates. Now I know for us, being told a god is masturbating to create other life might come off as unique or interesting or even gross, right? But we have to think about how these people during their time would have thought about, energy and creation. They would have thought about this masturbation, this idea of using the semen or the seed as a way to create life force, let us say. You see a lot of use of what I call the body or the visceral in early mythology. They're not afraid of it, right? Blood creates gods, semen creates gods. The things of the body, the energy of the body is very much important to these early mythologies. So it said he masturbates to create the first gods. And you'll notice I have them kind of into male and female categories. The first two are Shu and Tefruit. And you'll notice they represent elementals just like the Mesopotamian gods did. Things like the air and the moisture, right? Shu and Tefruit then couple up, right, and create Jeb and Nut, the earth and the sky, you'll notice. And then from there, Jeb and Nut pair up, right, to create Osiris and Seth and Isis and Aptithys. One thing I want to point out right away, you'll notice, is that these are brothers and sisters essentially, and these are incestuous relationships. Why am I bringing this up? Because Egyptian pharaohs will actually believe that they should only marry within their bloodline and as closely as possible. So for a male pharaoh, leading his people, he would want to marry his sister. I'm using marry in the most technical term, of course, and this is not what they would have said, right? They would have coupled up or mated or whatever. But the pharaoh would want to pair up with his sister or half sister or cousin or an aunt, someone very close within his own bloodline. Now we know where this leads, and it's probably why many of the dynasties fell, but they didn't. And notice that they're getting this from their own mythology in a sense. So it is important to consider the incest portion of this story, right? But Ra creates the gods this way, and then again the couples mate, right, and then create more gods as well. Now, for our purposes, Ra will be important. He's the sun god, so we'll go back to him a bit. And Osiris and his story, we're going to talk about in a minute as well. He's the god of the afterlife. His brother Seth, you'll know, is related to chaos. Isis, right, the goddess of motherhood, and Nephthys is the protector of the dead. We'll see those four and talk about those four a little bit more here. But again, just to give you a sense of some of this art, here's the art of Geb and Nut. And I always find it interesting in Egypt that Geb is the god of the earth. Usually, earth goddesses are female goddesses, right? But in Egypt, you'll notice the genders are flipped. Usually, again, later on, you'll see the opposite. So I always think that's something interesting to point out here in their mythology. And again, as I mentioned, I talked to you a little bit more about Isis, Osiris, right, here in a second. Now, why should we know Osiris? Osiris is the god of the dead, and the Egyptians, I jokingly say, lived to die. That's what they did. I always have my joke that if you had a bumper sticker on the back of a chariot in Egypt, it would say, "I live to die." These people believed very much in the afterlife and spent their lives preparing for it. This is why you see the elaborate tombs that you see, the tomb paintings, the tomb offerings, the grave goods, right? All of that, because this part of their existence. So they need a good god of the afterlife, and it is Osiris. Osiris's story. You'll note he was brothers with Seth, right? Married to his sister Isis, and Nephthys was married to Seth. You see the sisters behind him in this image as well. Seth, we always say, was very jealous of Osiris. Osiris was kind of the golden boy of the family, kind of considered the default ruler, right? The pharaoh type. Because as I said, the gods walked the earth originally. As they began to populate it, right? They walked it. So Seth kills Osiris and dismembers him, scattering his body parts, right, to all four corners of Egypt. Isis was sort of a sorceress. So she gathers the body parts back up, except for one. I'll get to that in a minute. She gathers all the body parts back up and reanimates him or brings him back to life. However, because one part was missing, the penis, he could no longer create life. And so he becomes, in a sense, the god of the dead and the protector of the land of the dead and its gatekeeper, in a sense. The person that you must prostrate yourself before if you want to gain entrance into the afterlife. Note in his imagery, he's shown wearing a white garment, almost like a mummy, and his skin is this green, like he is dead. So again, Osiris as the god of the dead, he'll be very important to us in our discussions. You might be surprised to hear me say then, after Osiris lost his penis, right? Then he had a son, Horus. You might say, well, wait a minute, hold up, right? Well, I mentioned that Isis was like a sorceress, right? So there's kind of two different stories here. That Isis made for Osiris like a magical penis, one use only, so she could be impregnated. Or my favorite story is that she just magically became pregnant. But why do we have to talk about Horus? We talk about Horus because I want you to understand that bloodline is very important to not just the mythology of the gods that you see here, but also to the Egyptian pharaohs. Who your descendants were, who would rule in your wake, that was very important. So Osiris needed to have a son, right? Needed to have somebody to carry on his legacy in a sense. Isis basically provides this to him, however way you want to hear the tale, right? We also need to talk about Horus because he's a hybrid, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I want you to look at these images related to Horus, Osiris, and Isis. And think about some similarities to imagery you may have seen in a different context of religion, especially the one on the right. Very Virgin Mary-like, is she not? And if you think about it, the sun disk, the way that these gods would have a sun disk above their heads, looks very similar to a halo. So I want you to think a little bit about what we call comparative religion. People who study religion, we talk about how all religions take from the religions before them. The Jews were in Egypt, we know that with certainty. And so we believe that they carried out certain beliefs or certain structures from Egypt. This idea of a magical pregnancy, many people wonder if this affects the Virgin Mary story later on down the line. The imagery certainly seems very much recycled to me. The use of the halo, right, for instance, not a way of worshiping the sun, perhaps, but now being translated a bit. Um, so again, many people talk about the various ideas that the Jews could have taken from Egypt. The idea of bodily burial, the idea of a soul. These are things that Egyptians believed in. So again, comparative religion to me is always something important to hit on or discuss as we move our way through the class, because you'll see how this starts to manifest as as we reach other religions and talk about the imagery in those religions. Now, I'd mentioned that we need to talk about Horus as well because he was a hybrid. What is a hybrid? A hybrid is something made up of two things, right? And the Egyptians favored hybrid gods. Um, they had gods that looked like humans, like Ra, but they also had these hybrid gods. And the hybrids were a combination of human characteristics and animal characteristics. So, so Horus is actually the falcon god. He has the head of a falcon and the body of a man. He can be shown in his hybrid form. He can also be shown in his purely animal form as well. As I mentioned, there are many hybrid gods in Egyptian worship. Now, people who study religion, they've gotten into why hybrids? Why does this become popular? And many people suggest the reason it becomes popular is because the Egyptians perhaps were trying to figure out how to move past animal worship, but, not completely leave it behind. So the way perhaps maybe they dealt with this, because we used to worship animals, when we were prehistoric people, we used to pray to them almost in a sense, probably. How do you combine that old impulse with this new, more anthropomorphized or sort of human centric religious urge? Hybrids probably will do the trick for you to have human and animal characteristics combined. Now, it's a theory, but I think it's a pretty damn good theory about why hybrids came to pass. Here you have two other hybrids, Hathor, head of a cow, body of a woman. She was known as the Great Nourisher. So it's sort of a nourishing presence, right, for the people of Egypt. And then the goddess Bast, one of my personal favorites because I love cats. The head of a cat, body of a woman. Um, and she is the protector of children and also the protector of the gateway between the living and the dead. So I always love talking about Bast because I'm a kitty person, but then of course I love talking about like sort of the role of what Bast did. Now, these hybrid gods were really fascinating because again they have this animal correlation. So if you were a priestess of Bast, your temple was filled with cats that you took care of. And let's say you were a priestess of Hathor again, you took care of cows. May not be as fun to be a priest of Sobek, the crocodile god, right? That'd be a little more snappy and dangerous, but you get my point. And so again, they would literally worship these animals, right? With the temples filled with these animals. Um, so being a priest of Bast, lots of fun. A priestess of Bast, fun. Priest of Sobek, maybe not so fun. Again, you see here Bast shown with the hybrid kind of look in the statuary, and then also purely as an animal. She was shown as a black cat. And, again, each family had a cat because they believed they had to protect the children of their family and that the cat would actually protect the children in their household from anything negative. So cats were actually considered sacred in Egyptian culture. And if your cat died, first off, you mummified it, but you also mourned it. They actually mourned cats for a year. So if your kitty, Miss Whiskers died, you would have to basically go into mourning your family for a year. And you would shave all your bodily hair, your eyebrows, hair, body hair, everything, and you dressed in white. If someone killed a cat in Egyptian culture, even on accident, they were killed. So cats are considered in very, very high regard, right, within Egyptian culture. The black cat of Bast, the highest. So if you think about how black cats are now considered in European culture, let's say, they're often seen as superstitious or bad luck, right? Many people talk about how that may have started when pagan religions were being sort of pushed out, when Christianity was rising, the monotheisms were rising, that you wanted to see these things as negative now. So that perhaps black cats, rather than being positive symbols, started to be demonized. So again, flipping the script a little bit, right? Sort of turning something on its head. So again, we talk about comparative religion. We also often talk about when a new religion starts to rise or a new system starts to rise, how do they negate or try to get rid of the old practices? So we think that's perhaps how black cats started to be viewed as a negative thing rather than a positive thing, like they were in Egyptian culture. Um, and you might also think about what I said about the idea of cats as protectors of the world between the living and the dead. If you've ever seen the movie The Mummy, the old school Mummy, the Brendan Fraser old mummy movie, right? It's a good movie too, by the way. Um, in that movie, there's this scene where Evie is sleeping and the mummy's trying to sneak in on her, right? He's coming through the keyhole like sand. And then Brendan Fraser busts in and holds up this cat, and the cat hisses. And the mummy's like, ah, and like gets the hell out of there. The reason why is because he knows the cat is the protector between the line between the living and the dead, and he's out of bounds. So he knows the cat's gonna like attack him. He has to leave. It's like a force field, right? Where he has to go. So again, this is another reason people kept cats in their homes, is they believed it could keep wandering spirits away, right? Keep them very protected and safe, right, within their home as well. So just some fun, stories about Bastian lore. Another hybrid that's very important to our discussion is Anubis. You see him here. Body of a man, head of a jackal, which is like a wild dog. And he was the god of mummification. So he worked alongside Osiris. So we'll see him when we talk about burial imagery, when we talk about mummification as a practice. We'll come back and see Anubis right again. The last thing I want to mention in this introduction sort of portion of our talk is the role of pharaohs and dynasties, the idea of rulership in Egypt. It's very important to understand that for Egyptians, their leadership was under a pharaoh or king, in a sense. However, you'll notice we use the word pharaoh because it actually is an Egyptian word. It came about in the New Kingdom period, and it meant great house. So, this idea of a great house of leadership. So, I prefer saying pharaoh because it is accurate to Egyptian discussion of leaders. The pharaohs ruled within individual dynasties. Now, for our purposes in the class, I'm not going to go into all the dynasties, but you can go Google a dynasty chart. They're very easy to find if you're interested in this kind of thing. I'm just going to stick to like the kingdoms for identification purposes. But each pharaoh was part of a dynasty or a ruling lineage or line. As I mentioned, these were incestuous lines of leadership, which is why they probably broke down over time because of the inbreeding factor. But a lot of the art we're going to talk about revolves around the rulership. So I often mention the two R's are very important in our class: rulers and religion. So I spend a lot of time introducing you to those concepts because they sort of hold sway over the art to a certain extent. For instance, in the image you see here, you're looking at Ramses II, who was a later New Kingdom leader, one of the last pharaohs. And I'm sure you can get a sense of his leadership, right? Just looking at his monument. So again, thinking about the pharaohs and the dynasties is going to be very important to us as we go along through the class.